Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing Chapter 21 out of America, A Narrative History by David Emory Shi. This particular chapter is somewhat of an overlap and a bit of a follow-up as well to Chapter 20, now that we've kind of discussed what America is doing at the end of the 19th century in terms of its foreign policy. Now that we can start to turn our gaze back to domestic policy and how that really starts to change. And it's a real turn of a corner, to be quite honest, compared to the way that the government was handling laissez-faire policies and so forth. Now it's essentially pivoting and going completely in the opposite direction, beginning to look at ways that it can improve the life of its citizens, trying to regulate businesses, trying to regulate working hours, and all this kind of stuff. So now we are looking at this gigantic movement known as progressivism. And progressivism becomes kind of a bipartisan effort over the course of the first decade or so of the 20th century, and has limited effects. There's different levels of success depending on the individuals involved. But we'll get into it here, and you can kind of see for yourself just how this ends up, well, progressing, I suppose. So the progressive era is something that, again, overlaps with the time period that we've already discussed, okay? It kind of filters in from Chapter 19 well into Chapter 20. And even though your book says that the progressive era ends in roughly 1920, it really ends, quite honestly, several years before that, probably with the beginning of World War I, all right? That's really the kind of the end cap, so to speak, for when all this comes to a halt. But the progressive era is, again, kind of a complete turnaround for the way the government has been operating, right? We end up moving more into social activism, and now politics are being used to directly facilitate these kinds of things, okay? So now we're looking at public issues, what is affecting the working class, what are causing the different quote-unquote social ills of the day, and how we can remedy those ills. And so this is it's a widespread movement, again, that's very bipartisan, and it comes on the heels of the 1896 election, when we saw William Jennings Bryan begin to turn the Democratic Party away from being the conservative pro-business party into one more concerned with social justice. Okay, so it's kind of that was the first rumblings of it that we saw, and now we're starting to see it becoming a much more widespread movement. And progressives themselves come across in very different ways, okay? And the idea of being a progressive, even today, is something that can carry with it some positive aspects, but at the same time, too, that it has a tendency to come across as patronizing in some regards, okay? So it's basically looking to promote liberal reform of some kind, right? Typically to do with laws that are, going to be, again, more beneficial to society in general, specifically to the working class, to the poor. And some of these types of laws are really spurred on by a sense of Christian moralism, okay, and this idea that we can somehow improve mankind. It's very idealistic, right? And in some cases, there is a practical application to it, but in many respects, progressivism tends to kind of overextend its reach to where it can't actually fulfill all the promises it wants to make. And we talked also in Chapter 19 about the fact that now that science is becoming more prevalent in society, it's kind of becoming more accessible. People are starting to listen to scientists. Again, religious leaders are not exactly thrilled about this idea, but certain sciences, not just the hard sciences, but social sciences as well, are beginning to be applied to these different social theories concerning liberal reform. Okay, and so we use sociology to determine that perhaps alcohol is causing several issues in society, or that all kinds of the wage gaps and so forth that are going on are not really helping society function to its fullest extent. Okay, so all of these types of things are now starting to play a role, and there's a lot of intellectualism that goes into this, for better or for worse. Okay. Intellectualism in some cases comes across as somewhat snobbish, If you have someone who is a liberal reformer, a progressive, who is perhaps like an economist or a sociologist, right? Sometimes they get a little bit elitist with their ideas, okay? And so they basically say, well, I know better than you do, so I'm the one who should be put in charge of these types of laws and, putting legislation forth and all that kind of stuff. So it doesn't exactly have 100% endorsement, nor does it actually come across as 100% beneficial. Okay, so it has kind of a mixed bag. And of course, as well, not only do we have the intellectual snobbery aspect of this, but because science is still so heavily embedded in some ethnic and racist ideologies, or ethnocentric and racist ideologies, I should say, now all of that is starting to get more and more cemented in the minds of society. Okay, and people start to use science as an excuse to justify certain horrible actions, right? Again, segregation, racism, both violent and institutionalized, all of this kind of stuff is starting to become, again, much more endorsed by the scientific community and legitimize, okay? And the specific parts of this that don't actually go away anytime soon are what we ultimately see moving into the 1930s and 40s once the Nazi Party starts to really gain traction. It's the kind of stuff they end up adopting and taking to the next level and beyond. Okay, so this is a really dangerous time for new ideas. By the time we get to the late 19th century, now that the federal government is starting to expand to the level that it needs to operate at in order for it to be able to cover the entire continental United States, again, now that we've got the government expanding so much, we have grown about 5 times what we were before in terms of the number of federal employees. We only had about 50,000 people working for the government at one point. I think it was around 1870. And by the time we get to the 1890s, we have, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 people. And again, it's starting to move past the size of certain big businesses, and so business doesn't exactly have the level of influence that it did before. And so now the government can actually lean on big business a little bit and cause it to change some of its policies. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we have the Depression in 1893, where we end up trying to go into a silver standard. Grover Cleveland and other individuals basically go back on this idea of us changing over to that, try to commit us to a gold standard, makes things worse. And so finally, once the government starts to look at these alternative ways of evaluating what's wrong with society, it's not just money. They start to look at economic reform. They start to look at different legislation they can pass in order to regulate that. And so some of that starts to filter forward into the first decade or so of the 20th century as well. As a direct result of the Depression in 1893, by 1900, there's 10 million Americans living in poverty. And to give you a sense of the ratio, how that all kind of works together, the total U.S. population at the time is only 82 million. So it's significantly smaller than it is today. I mean, today we're in the hundreds of millions by comparison. And it's primarily the upper middle class workers who are engaged in charitable work, in trying to help these progressive movements come to fruition on the ground level. And in part, they don't really do it necessarily out of entirely altruistic purposes. In some cases, they're doing it out of fear, because they realize that there are alternative methods of government that are in place, like communism, for example, anarchism. There's a lot of sympathy for that based on the several different immigrant groups who are coming from Central and Eastern Europe. The communist revolution in Russia hasn't happened yet. That doesn't happen until 1912. Or into 1917, I mean. But we're still at that point right now where there's enough class distinction and enough social class tensions going on to where it would be very, very easy for the sheer number of working class individuals to basically rise up and overthrow and take over society, right? Just because there are so few people that have so much wealth at this point. And of course, we talked in Chapter 19 about the mugwumps as well, right? This branch of the Republican Party that separates off into kind of a third party in politics and is really after this whole honest government movement. Now that we have Teddy Roosevelt in office, though, things are starting to work more into the favor of the Republican Party. He is very much a reform individual, right? He's very focused on the idea of us doing away with corruption, doing away with the spoils system and all that. So some of that is finally starting to come to fulfillment here. And the other thing, too, is the further along you get with the progressive movement, the more you start to focus on the individual and the more you start to focus on social justice and rights, you start to move into the area of socialism. Okay? And again, socialism is one other alternative form of government during this point in time, and socialism is really more of a social movement. It's not necessarily the political movement that we know it to be today in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and all that kind of stuff. But socialism is basically trying to promote a greater equality among social classes. In other words, removing social class distinctions through redistribution of wealth and those types of things. Much of what we see with current presidential candidates like Bernie Sanders, for example, right? He is typically characterized as a democratic socialist. Okay. And the Socialist Party actually starts to gain a lot of traction during this point in time. And by the time we get to 1912, the Socialist Party actually has a candidate, a major candidate running for president, and actually gains a lot of votes as a direct result. And the Socialist Party also gets a lot of support from the immigrant contingency, primarily farmers who are becoming more and more militant. They're getting tired of being pushed aside by Republican legislation and that sort of thing, and also immigrant Germans and Jews in particular. Okay, we're now having many more immigrants who are coming to the United States with this second wave of quote-unquote new immigrants beginning in the 1880s and 1890s. And a lot of them are coming from areas that have been, ravaged by, political thuggery and, religious revolutions and so forth. So they start to look at this as being something potentially beneficial. And it comes out in direct opposition to the idea of European mercantilism as well. Okay? And mercantilism is something that the federal government does end up getting involved with in both World Wars, I and II. But what it essentially entails is that the government takes control of the means of production in the United States and ends up directly controlling what is output from factories, how much of it is put out, and that sort of thing. And specifically, the reason it's done during the wars is so we can ramp up, armaments productions, ammunition, guns, tanks, planes, and so forth. And the Socialist Party is against this idea because it thinks that it's too much in the opposite direction. Right? It's too. We haven't reached the point in time where the term fascism has been actually adopted just yet, but this is kind of the first rumblings of that particular confrontation as well. Right? The very heavy polarization of politics between the right and the left. And of course, like I said, the Socialist Party is very much in support of better working conditions, right? It primarily focuses on the working class and to try to pass certain tax legislation so we can close all the wealth gaps. Okay? In other words, we want it to where everybody is earning the same amount of wealth in the United States and no one has too much authority over anybody else through corrupt means. And the other big feature of progressivism during this point in time is a movement called muckraking. Okay, and this has specifically to do with a form of journalism, and where journalists are taking on a progressive tone by exposing corruption in some form or another. Okay, in other words, they're digging up dirt, they're raking muck. And that kind of thing in society, looking through all of the nastiness and taking out stuff and exposing it to the public. Okay, so muckraking journalists tend to go out and write large exposés about again, working conditions or living conditions in the United States, just essentially raising awareness is what it mostly has to do with. And the term muckrakers is actually coined by Roosevelt himself. Okay, and he starts to use muckraking to to support his policies, to basically say, look at what these individuals are starting to uncover. We need to start enacting legislation to combat this. So he is very much an activist president. Okay. And one particular muckraking journalist that gets a lot of attention, and rightly so, is a guy named Jacob Riis. And Riis is a Danish-American immigrant who is a photojournalist, and he specifically records the lives of the working class living in the slums of New York. He writes a book called How the Other Half Lives, which I believe is published in the year 1900. I could be wrong about that. I need to check the date. But the photographs that he records is stuff that, again, most middle-class and upper-class Americans would probably never see in their day-to-day lives. Okay, it's basically individuals living in extreme poverty, in just absolute squalor in New York City. You see individuals who are living in tenement houses that are so warped by a lack of positive building codes that they're all falling apart. Some individuals who are living in like a studio apartment that's maybe 1,000 square feet, that's or less than that perhaps, that, you know, it's a family of 7 or something along those lines. Or you have, you know, a certain place where you can go if you're an itinerant worker, and you can rent a cot for 7 cents a night and stay there, and it's just lined wall to wall with cots. Right? There's a lot of disease, there's a lot of trash, there's lots of filth in general, and so he's really starts to draw more and more attention to that and the kinds of social reforms that need to take place in order to combat that. Okay, so he's extremely instrumental in causing new legislation to come around, and he gets a lot of support from Teddy Roosevelt in particular. The children that you see here in the background of this image are all young boys who are, and I think a couple of young girls as well, working in the coal mines. I believe this is somewhere perhaps in West Virginia or Pennsylvania, something along those lines. And child labor is still very much a reality during this point. We haven't exactly gone through any major legislation to limit or prevent it just yet, but beginning with Roosevelt and the Progressive Movement, we start to see this actually coming about. For one thing, a brand new institution that's actually established during this point in time is called a settlement house. Okay? And a settlement house, in some respects, acts in a very similar way to the way a community center might work today in a city or in a small town, or even like a YMCA might be. Okay, it provides social services to the community where they need it, restrooms, showers, places like that, exercise and so forth. Again, very similar to a gymnasium, the way it might be. But it also has offices that can help individuals find work. It offers certain classes, childcare in some cases. And by 1900, there are several hundreds of these in the northeastern portion of the United States, and even some portions of the Midwest as well. Hull House is the most famous one that was constructed in Chicago, and is run by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. Okay? Again, Jane Addams is known for being the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for her work in all this. Both of them come from privileged backgrounds. Both of them are very much part of this upper middle class that is actually focused in a much more altruistic way of working with the poor. They're not really concerned about the repercussions of not working with them for their own sake, but for the sake of the people they work with. So they work with a lot of the poor, specifically with immigrants, right, trying to help them adapt to life in the United States, how to find work, how to negotiate contracts, and so forth. And ultimately, they end up with 24 women on staff that serve several thousands of people each and every week. So it's kind of a revolving door with everything that they do. And Hull House is extremely proficient with all that it can offer. Okay, it's got a nursery, it's got health clinics. Again, there are classes you can take, different little social clubs. There's an employment bureau, job training, and even a savings bank and coffee house are attached to it at some point as well. So it's kind of an all-in-one community center type atmosphere. And eventually, the problem with settlement houses is, again, just like we saw at the end of the Civil War, once Reconstruction begins, is with things like the Freedmen's Bureau, is that it's eventually outpaced by the need. Okay, charity can only go so far when it's not being directly sponsored by a major government or something along those lines. Okay, and so it turns out that, while Hull House is very important, it needs to be taken to the next level in order to actually cover all of the need that's actually present. And so Jane Addams is actually kind of conscripted into several different community boards, several government committees to try to determine what sorts of improvements are needed. And she's part of the reason why we start to see, running water and sewer systems and all that kind of thing, sanitation departments being added to cities, because she realizes that a lot of the illness and a lot of the decrepitude that she sees on a regular basis is stemming simply from poor hygiene and poor living conditions. And another part of this that is, again, not necessarily an altruistic way of looking at this, but it's a reason that's given, is something known as the social gospel. Okay? And this is a specifically Protestant belief that the more charity can be shown to society, the closer humanity will get to the second coming of Christ. Okay, that basically this is going to cause the kingdom of God to come to earth, either in a metaphorical or, in some people's minds, a literal sense. Okay, that this is somehow going to usher in a brand new and better era of time. Okay, and again, the idea of all these new social reforms fits very nicely into this. Okay, so in other words, there is some sort of a reward that people are expecting to go along with this, again, whether metaphorical or literal. And in part, people start to use the ideas of social Darwinism as kind of a demonized form of thinking. Okay, and Darwinism in general starts to come under a lot of scrutiny, beginning in around the turn of the century and moving on, especially into the 1920s, which we'll see in another chapter or two. But social Darwinism in particular, again, is essentially the exact opposite of what we see with progressivism in general. Right? People who are social Darwinists basically say that if, this is survival of the fittest, right? The government doesn't have any right to interfere with people's lives. People should be able to let them starve and die and wither away. And those who have, done the starving and the killing and all this kind of stuff, they deserve to get, whatever reward they get. So in this case, though, the government is actually saying, no, we do need to intervene here somehow. And on the subject of YMCAs and YWCAs, right? YMCA just means Young Men's Christian Association, and YWCA is the women's version. Both of these are imported to the United States from England sometime in the 1850s. And just like we see with the settlement houses, it's a very, very similar idea. And of course, there's no coincidence that they show up around the same time. Okay, it's a sort of low-cost housing and exercise facility for people who are essentially new arrivals in cities, right? It's not necessarily just the gymnasium aspect of it today that we see, but back then it had actual housing that could be either temporary housing for immigrants who are showing up for the first time, or if you fall on hard times and you have the money to pay for a room or something like that, then you can do that as well. And eventually there is a Hebrew counterpart for this as well. Okay, and this is another element of progressivism in that it does have a little bit of a plurality to it in terms of acceptance. Okay, and again, this is part of that liberal reform that we start to see. Right, we're not so homogenous in terms of just only welcoming Protestant Christianity. Now we can open our doors to further opportunities and further audiences, essentially. And the Salvation Army is another thing that comes from England to the United States in 1879. And this is extending, more social services, soup kitchens, child care, and that sort of thing. And of course, now we know it for primarily clothing drives and donation buckets around the holidays and that sort of thing, but has its origins during this time period. And of course, the political reforms that go with this are the very next step after charity ends up kind of running its course. For one thing, one beneficial aspect of society during this point is that female employment in the United States has skyrocketed. In 1880, it was about 2.6 million, and by the time we get to 1910, we get to 7.8 million. Okay, so in other words, more women are starting to break away from this cult of domesticity. They're not just staying home, taking care of the kids, not working or doing anything like that. They're not being put into kind of this pigeonholed way of life anymore. And we already said, back when we talked about the Old West, that in 1869, the Wyoming Territory began to allow universal suffrage for women as well. Okay, just because of the sheer number of women that were starting to have to take control of their lives in this particular territory. Again, if you were married to a man, or if you were living, with your father or something like that, and if the provider of the house gets injured or killed or something, then you have to take charge, take control, and become more independent. And so Wyoming is very progressive in its ways of facilitating that. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are two other ladies who are actually also very instrumental in these new women's movements as well. Okay, we started off trying to add women's suffrage to the 15th Amendment as well. Both of these women were kind of led the charge on that. And up until now, they've been largely ignored on the official national stage. Okay, they've had to found a particular social movement, the National Women's Suffrage Association, to promote the idea of universal women's suffrage at the federal level. And the suffragette movement is something that is meets with all kinds of opposition throughout this time period, leading all the way up until 1920, when the 19th Amendment is passed and women are able to vote. Okay. And the NWSA, this first version of this, promotes equal pay and easier divorce settlements for abused wives as well. So women are still being extremely marginalized when it comes to divorce settlements. Okay, husbands are typically given custody of the children no matter what the situation is, and the woman is essentially left with nothing. Okay, and again, equal pay is still something that we campaign for even in today's society in the 21st century. Another branch of this that differs just slightly is called the American Women's Suffrage Association. This is one that is exclusively focusing on women's voting rights, more so than anything else. It's a little bit more pinpointed than the NWSA is. And eventually the two do end up uniting in 1890 to form the NAWSA. So lots of acronyms here, but none that you necessarily need to worry about for this particular course. And women's suffrage is something that does, happen in fits and starts all over the country. It's not really something that just boom happens overnight and then the rest is history. But we do have several different states, beginning with the Wyoming Territory, moving into other areas, specifically in the Midwest, and one or two in New England before it actually ends up falling like dominoes into the big event that happens in 1920. And now that we're in the 20th century, okay, we're now in the big chunk of meat for this particular course, there are two particular features of politics in America, especially during the beginning of the 20th century. First one is the idea of direct democracy. Okay, and this is, again, a big change from what we saw at the end of the 19th century. Again, Americans are getting much more of a direct voice in politics than they ever have before. We don't necessarily have corrupt corporations who are making all the decisions now. They're not really in bed with the Republican Party as much as they were. And so now that the people themselves are getting more of a voice, new legislation is getting passed, and things are actually getting done on the ground level. And the other thing is the final fulfillment that we see of the federal government expanding its power. Okay, we've been trying to do this ever since the end of the Civil War. We haven't had the level of success we've tried to get, but now that all these political movements have happened all through the end of the 19th century, showing that capitalism is kind of floundering a little bit here and there, people start to move into a little bit more of a socialistic mindset, and things start to change a little bit. One of the aspects of direct democracy is called a direct primary. And this is basically where all members of a political party now have the ability to vote for the candidate that they want to represent them. Okay? Before then, it was originally a small group of men who would meet in a back room somewhere in a state legislature and make the decision for everybody. But now we have a direct access from the people to voting someone into office. And South Dakota is actually the first state to adopt this idea, and the idea of something called the initiative and referendum process. Okay, and this is what allows citizens themselves to create laws rather than just allowing the legislative branch of government to do it. So again, it's much more democratic this way. The initiative process has individuals signing a petition to have a proposal added to a voter ballot. So in other words, you get X number of signatures, you prove that there's enough support for a particular idea, a particular movement, it gets added for consideration to the next voting round. Okay. And then the referendum is the actual vote itself, right? Whether to vote this up and pass it or to vote it down and decline it. Okay, so again, much more of a direct process than what you see with the legislative branch of government doing everything for the people. Okay, ends up eliminating a little bit of corruption along the way. And by 1920, there's nearly 20 states in the Union that have adopted this particular practice because it's so successful. Okay? And even in some aspects in the United States, we see this from time to time today. It's not used probably as frequently as it was back then, but in certain regards it is. And the other thing, too, is we now have the ability to recall corrupt politicians, right? We have the ability to hold them accountable, to recall them by essentially removing them from office, right? If a public, a group of individuals looks at a particular politician and says they don't have our best interests at heart, we go through the initiative and referendum process, and if it passes in the referendum, then the person ends up being removed from office. And again, 12 states do this in 1920. And in 1913, we get the 17th Amendment is passed as well. This is a kind of another step in the same direction. Provides for the direct election of senators, just so we can avoid that kind of corruption. Again, we're trying to move away from the spoil system. We're trying to move away from political favoritism, nepotism, and that sort of thing. So now the public themselves have a direct way of being involved in the election of a senator. The commission system is another brand new idea here, and this is something that completely does away with the idea of political parties and becomes a nonpartisan way of operating a local government. Basically, in a small town or even in a major city in some cases, in most cases now, you have the authority surrounding a city that is actually placed on a commission board, right? You have several board members combining a legislative and executive power in one political body to head up certain city departments. So you have a board member that represents sanitation, you have one that represents the police, you have one that represents fire safety, and all these kinds of areas of city law and city ordinance. And this particular version of city politics is actually adopted in 1901 after the Galveston hurricane that happens here in Texas. And this was a massive natural disaster that occurs. More than 8,000 people are killed, and the hurricane is so intense and there's such a lack of preparation for it that it ends up completely collapsing the local government. The people who are in charge are basically like chickens running around with their heads cut off. There's not really any direction. There's not a plan in place, and there's no contingency for this. Okay, and so once the commission system is put into place, then we start to see people putting in, emergency contingencies in case something like this happens again, in case of invasion of some kind, in case of natural disaster, in case of lawlessness, whatever. Right? There's all kinds of different ways that this can go. At the head of all this is a city manager, right? We have a mayor, of course, of the town, but we also have a city manager. And this is an individual who runs a city or a county government based on the policies either of a town council or of a mayor who kind of hands down the decision to them. Okay, and so a city manager is an appointed professional rather than an elected individual. So there's no party politics involved. It's based on a political appointment, but it's merit based as well. So again, we're moving away from the spoil system here. And there are some downsides to this. I mean, separating local government away from party politics does end up removing some of the positive associations that people have with political parties. They don't necessarily feel like their voice is being heard the way perhaps that it was when they belonged to a political party. If you're a working class voter, right, you basically have the same voice as someone who, ostensibly anyway, is someone who is a middle class or an upper class voter, but again, you're not able to rally around labor union or anybody like that who has extra influence. Okay, so it is limiting in some ways. And the other thing too is it's mainly focused on process improvement. Okay, so it's not necessarily about adding new ideas or new services of any kind to a city, but how to expedite a process that already exists. Okay, so it's limiting in that regard as well. And the man who's responsible for coming up with this idea is a Republican governor from Wisconsin named Robert La Follette. And his whole idea that he comes up with that's kind of the precursor to this is something that he refers to as the Legislative Reference Bureau. Okay, and it's essentially a compendium that he creates in the local area that's kind of like a law library, right, where you can go and you can look up certain situations, you can look up historical evidence of events and how they've been handled to determine how to handle a situation should it arise. And so this ends up leading to a lot more of the direct primary processes being put into place, local railroad regulation, you get a lot more resource conservation, and workmen's compensation programs get put into place for this as well. And it's nicknamed the Wisconsin idea because of where it comes from. Okay, so the whole idea of the commission system, having a city manager and all that, all of it originates with Robert La Follette. And by the time we get to 1900, the other thing, too, is that the government realizes that now that it has surpassed big business in terms of its size, the responsibility is falling on it to regulate big business altogether, right? To prevent it from, reaching into people's lives too much, from harming its workers and so forth. And from 1895 up until 1904, again, we see big business in a state where it is bloated beyond what it should be. Okay, there's 157 holding companies that have been created to establish legal monopolies that have gained control of over 1,800 different businesses. Okay, we talked about the idea of horizontal integration with individuals like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, the way that they create trust funds and shell companies to move around their money, to hide the fact that they're investing in their competitors and all this kind of stuff. And so it does create a legal monopoly via several loopholes. And it's estimated that 50 holding companies control over 70% of the market in their industries. So again, individuals are looking for that 100%, but still 70% is a massive number, right? And it's eliminating fair competition by them doing this, right? They're spying on their competitors. In some cases, they're even getting a check from their competitors because they've become trustees in their competitors' companies through all these shell holdings and so forth. In 1896, there's fewer than 12 companies other than the railroad that are worth $10 million or more. But by 1903, there's over 300 of them. Okay, so this is numbers that are expanding dramatically, and again, it's not creating any fair competition anymore, right? Capitalism is expanding beyond its normal boundaries. Sorry, I love this background image. This is actually an image that's an advertisement for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the sign in the background, and you can't see it here, but it says, lips that touch liquor will not touch ours. Okay, so these are women who are basically saying, don't drink, or we won't kiss you. So there's all kinds of different social justice movements that happen during this point in time, and the temperance movement is one of them. It begins sometime in the late 1870s, early 1880s. But other movements include the National Consumers League. Okay, and so this is where you basically have individuals who are trying to expose corruption in harsh working conditions in factories and mills, and you still see this type of thing happen today, right? A few years ago, when it started to come out that certain pieces of technology, like the iPods and the iPhones, certain really expensive women's purses and so forth, were being made via slave labor in Chinese factories, for example. Okay, that's the kind of thing that the National Consumers League would have jumped on immediately, right? Trying to basically say, don't buy these particular products because they're being made with unethical means or through slave labor and so forth. The General Federation of Women's Clubs is another particular branch that kind of goes along the same lines and is in some ways a spin-off of the the suffragette movement in a certain regard, and it basically says that civic life needs more female leadership. Okay, saying that it's something that is a humanizing element that is lost when men are directly involved all the time. Okay, and again, part of it is trying to move away from the whole social Darwinist, let's kill each other via competition, and whoever survives gets all the money, that kind of thing. What the Federation of Women's Clubs is saying that is if you add women to the mix, that somehow this is going to eliminate that competition. There's going to be more cooperation, and we kind of lead more into the idea of reform Darwinism, like we talked about in Chapter 19. Okay, where women are basically fulfilling the idea of human cooperation with each other to go toward a better standard of living than competition. And in some cases, this includes the idea of municipal housekeeping, right? Basically going in and firing anybody who is corrupt rather than just allowing them to keep their jobs and slapping them on the wrist. Trying to educate any slum residents, right? Trying to give them a better sense of personal hygiene, and so forth, right? Trying to do everything it can to regulate people's lives, but in a positive way. Of course, the construction of sewer systems is another thing, right? This is part of what Jane Addams is directly involved with. And of course, we start to see more public awareness campaigns as well, and this is pretty ahead of its time, right? We still see this happen all the way up through the 1980s, the 1990s, and even today, right? When we start to see ads targeting, sexually transmitted diseases, and of course other illnesses of different kinds and so forth that are preventable and can be easily prevented, but are just allowed to continue via neglect. And of course, the whole idea of municipal housekeeping also extends more rights to women in general, right? For the idea of child care centers, and not just for women, but for people in general as well. Okay, the idea of having better food processing plants that are, subject to government inspection, right? So we don't have spoiled food and that sort of thing. Of course, stricter housing codes so that if people do live in tenement houses, that houses are not going to fall apart. Fires are not going to happen, and laws specifically protecting women in the workplace, because again, they are one of the groups that is actually so heavily marginalized and objectified as well. Okay, if you are a woman who is a member of the working class, it's very easy for you to not only be subjected to harsher working conditions for less pay, but there is also the possibility that your supervisor might be a sexual predator as well. So again, kind of along the lines of what we see with the modern Me Too movement, right? It's a very, very early form of that, just trying to regulate businesses a little bit better. Again, still far and away what it is now, but again, heading in the right direction at least. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union is something, again, that was founded in the mid-1870s as a way to start to combat the social problems caused by alcohol or the abuse thereof. Okay, started by a woman named Frances Willard. And by 1900, it's so popular it has over 300,000 members. Okay, and the Temperance Union is not necessarily devoted directly to prohibition of alcohol. Right, initially it begins as a moderation movement, saying that as long as if you have a drink every once in a while, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But, don't let yourself get so drunk that you go home and beat up your family and commit a crime and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so it's basically acting like any other government regulatory agency during this time tries to act. Eventually, over time, there are spin-offs of it that become much more prohibition-driven. And it looks at alcohol in one of two ways, right? Again, this is what causes the spin-offs to end up occurring, whether it is actually a social problem or whether it is actually a sin altogether, okay? The individuals who associate it with sin are the ones who tend to be much more extreme with their views, the ones who want to get rid of it entirely. And the social problem one tries to examine ways to potentially limit it or, try to encourage people not to overindulge, right? So there's, again, the difference between moderation and prohibition kind of originates here. And of course, there's several goals in trying to prevent drunkenness, okay? Not just preventing domestic violence and improving family life, but Of course, reducing street crime is another thing. Again, this is where the sociological aspect of progressivism comes in. People look at statistics, who is more likely to, rob somebody and why, right? If you're trying to rob somebody so you can get money to go buy alcohol, right? It could be looked at as a problem. And the other thing, too, is because pubs are such a popular gathering place during the 19th century, and because they also have polling stations in many of them, people start to look at this as a potential issue when it comes to political corruption, right? If you have an election that's held in a pub, right, and the local candidate is coming around buying everybody a drink, you're essentially buying votes from the working class by getting everybody good and wasted. Okay, so there is a functional aspect to this as well, rather than just a theoretical one. And like I said, eventually, over time and with the ramping up of the arguments and so forth, you start to see the temperance movement become much more extreme. And the photograph that you see in the background with the temperance union, women saying lips that touch alcohol will not touch ours, this is the much more extreme aspect, right? They're saying even if you have a drink every once in a while, we still want nothing to do with you. Okay, so again, in some cases it does lead to further social division, but there is a unifying theme of alcohol, among other things, causing issues. And in 1893, another establishment that's established that's kind of a branch off of this is the Anti-Saloon League. This is where individuals like Carrie Nation, who we saw in the last chapter, the little old lady with the Bible in one hand and the hatchet in the other, start to become much more prominent as well. Okay? The Anti-Saloon League is one that goes about trying to outlaw saloons in general because they're, centers of drunkenness and prostitution and gambling and all that kind of stuff. And in 1913, they're the ones who actually end up endorsing the 18th Amendment, which ends up, enacting prohibition altogether. Okay, so eventually the prohibitionists do win out for a brief time before prohibition is repealed. And again, we're still in that point in time where there is tons and tons of child labor occurring. And the children that you see here in the background, again, are all members of the working class. These are all young boys who are probably working in factories, who are working. It doesn't look like any of them are really working in mines because they're not covered in coal dust. But by and large, right, if you're a child as young as some of these kids look like they might be 6 or 7 years old, right, are put to work very early on. And in 1890, 50% of America's workers in general are working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And again, the working conditions are horrible. Sometimes they're unsanitary, depending on what industry people are working in. And they're working for very, very low wages. Okay, there's basically no guarantee that you're going to get paid anything more than your entry salary for the rest of your life, right? There's not really any guarantee of raises or anything like that, or workers' compensation if you happen to lose a finger, a hand, an arm, your life, or anything like that. Okay, so it's an extremely difficult lifestyle to keep up with. And because of that, because of the low wages, fewer than half of families in the U.S. are able to live on a husband's earnings alone. Okay, so if you are a family in the working class, chances are every member of your family who is at least over the age of 5 or 6 has a job. Okay, so again, and that includes wives, children, everybody in the family. Okay, so it's an extremely stressful lifestyle is the best way I can put it. And married women in many cases will end up taking on certain tasks that they can do either in the house itself or that they can do in the immediate vicinity, so that if they do have children, if the children are not old enough to go to work yet, they can keep them with them somehow, have them help out. So, sewing, selling flower arrangements, preparing food, and even taking boarders in if you have a house that's large enough, or if you have a spare room that you want to rent out to a tenant or something like that. Again, there's all kinds of ways of filling the gap, but none of them are particularly easy here. And reformers start to target specifically women's work days as well, basically saying that because women have to take care of children, because they have responsibilities as mothers as well, we don't need to try to keep them away from their children too much, right? We need to start actually, giving them a little bit of a break here. And again, if you are a child living in a poor family, chances are, because of the lack of social upward mobility that you have to look forward to later in life, you may be taken out of school from a very early age and be put directly to work. Okay, so by the time these children end up growing up, by the time they end up getting into the 20s and the 30s and so forth, many of them are illiterate. Many of them have never had an education at all. And some of them don't even gain an education until they come back from one of the major wars. Okay, so it's a very harsh reality, and this is part of the reason why some of these the generation that survives World War I especially is called the lost generation, because they lose so much of themselves, so much of their childhood and their personal identity as a direct result of all the problems in society. And by 1900, about 1 3/4 million children in the U.S. between the ages of 10 to 15 are working outside of the home full-time. Okay, so again, there's no guarantee that you're going to go to school full-time, that you're going to be able to really get out of the predicament that you have been born into. And the government finally begins to have certain small branches that start to campaign on behalf of child labor. The National Child Labor Committee tries to campaign to end child labor within 10 years, in most states anyway. It's not able to do it universally. And one major event that occurs in March of 1911 that kind of, drives home the point of young children, young women, and people in general who are being, exploited for their labor is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And this is a building in New York City that a shirtwaist in this case refers to a woman's blouse, and that's basically what this particular factory was outputting was women's blouses. And there's several different theories about how the fire exactly starts. It surrounds the issue of young immigrant women who are working in a sweatshop up on the top floor of the factory. Here you see this from the photograph here, kind of the top 2 or 3 floors here are all kind of are blackened right now because of all the smoke and all the fire and everything. But these floors were worked by women who were essentially locked into a workspace by the owners, who were accusing them of stealing spools of thread, of stealing scraps of cloth to make their own clothes and that sort of thing. And this is high-end cloth, right? It's satin or silk or something along those lines. It's expensive stuff. And for one reason or another, a fire ends up starting in the building while the owner has been away. The owner locks the women in. There's no fire escapes. And many of the women and the workers, not all of them are women, most of them are though, are trapped inside of the building, okay, and ends up with very few escape routes, very poor ventilation, and we end up with 146 workers who end up dying here. I believe the final total is 65 of them who end up jumping out of the windows and dying on the sidewalk. And if you go to the Library of Congress website, you can see the direct aftermath of this. It was a major, major event that ends up changing, again, a lot of legislation in the United States, requiring businesses to install, correct escape routes, to make sure that, workers are not going to be put into danger, just by poor management and so forth. And the heartbreaking thing, too, about this is there are actually eyewitness accounts that were reported via muckraking journalism of individuals jumping out of the windows and so forth. And the photographs show the bodies of the people literally being put directly into a coffin on the sidewalk, because many of them don't have families. Okay, so it's again, extremely heartbreaking situation that you end up seeing. And there's only so much that the city itself is able to do, right? You see a small fire wagon that's able to come around and try to put out part of the fire, and there is some sort of a safety net that the fire department actually begins to use during this time for people who are trying to escape a building like this, trying to jump out of a window. But because of the height of the buildings and because of the fact that, as horrible as it sounds, many of the people who jumped were actually on fire, the safety nets would break and the people's bodies would literally fall through the nets and they would die on the sidewalk anyway. Okay, so it's ends up setting a precedent that leads to a definite need for more legislation. And most of the workers in this particular factory, again, are a young female contingency, most of whom are foreign-born. Right? There's a lot of Italian, Jewish, and Russian immigrants, especially. And again, if you're an immigrant, you're part of that contingency during this point in time that doesn't get a whole lot of the benefits of legislation. Okay, you're the part of the demographic that quite often ends up falling into one of these situations, right? Because of neglect, because of the poor management, and so forth. Okay, so this, again, sets a brand new precedent and moves us into a different direction with labor legislation. The other thing that the government begins to do here, too, is it starts to look at imposing a brand new form of income tax and how it can start to regulate big business even further. And a lot of it has to do with Teddy Roosevelt's policies. For one thing, the progressive movement also involves a progressive income tax. Okay, basically saying that it's an income-based tax approach. Okay, your tax rates rise progressively as your income progresses. Okay, and it's still the case today, right? If you make a certain amount, you're only taxed a certain amount. But if you make above a certain amount, you move into a different tax bracket, and the government taxes you more. 1894, William Jennings Bryan is actually the first individual to start to move this forward in Congress. He persuades Congress to approve a 2% tax rate on annual incomes over $4,000. Okay, and many people in the United States didn't make that much at all. Okay, if you're a farmer during this time period, average annual salary that you might make might only be a few $100s, just based on the adjusted for inflation and so forth, right? So it's significantly less than what you would make if you made $4,000 or more. And of course, this is initially approved, and the wealthy throw a fit, right? Because they think that they're being unjustly taxed here. They think that this is targeting them because they're making so much money. And again, in a progressive approach to things, the progressives want to redistribute the money, right? They want this to, all be leveled off and evened out. And of course, the wealthy are not necessarily warm to this idea. Okay. And eventually it is declared unconstitutional, but on a very small loophole technicality. Okay, basically saying that the government doesn't have the right to impose that on everybody, that somehow it, removes their right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, something along those lines. Okay. And by 1907, once Teddy Roosevelt gets into office, he begins to support a progressive tax as well. Okay. And in 1909, once William Howard Taft succeeds him as president, he starts to endorse the first constitutional amendment to allow the tax. And it's not really until 1913 that we see the 16th Amendment come through. Okay. And this is what ratifies. It's ratified because of the need to slow the concentration of wealth, because so many people during the Gilded Age, why it's called the Gilded Age, end up accruing so much wealth that it ends up leading to that big wage gap, a lot of social tensions, and so forth. So, and many of them do it through criminal means. Okay, so this is the government really stepping in and trying to, take note of what is going on in people's lives and trying to regulate it that way. And the federal reform efforts are not really as widespread as you would really think until Roosevelt gets into office in 1901. And again, because of Roosevelt's personality, because he is so forceful, because he's so eager to get what he wants, and because he casts everything in a moral light, people are more willing to listen to him. Okay, he's not just towing the party line for the Republicans like most of the other presidents before him did. Right? They're not really trying to appease big business, or he's not trying to appease big business. He's trying to fight against it. And again, William McKinley is not willing to upset the status quo, right? He thinks that he's riding high because of the success with the Spanish-American War, gaining all the new territories that the United States has to exploit now. And he thinks that if he goes back and tries to combat these people, that it's going to lead to too much social division, too much political division, and he'll end up losing what he had. And it's funny because Roosevelt is actually, he's referred to here as a steam engine in trousers. Okay, he's such an activist president in terms of being physically active. He refers early on in life to being exposed to the idea of living the hard life, or living the disciplined life. Okay, okay, trying to build up his body, right, be a bodybuilder. He was a boxer for a long time. He was a hunter. When he has diplomats come to the White House, for example, he'll invite them out to climb trees, to box, to wrestle. He's almost like a little kid, right? He's kind of that. His attention is not really so focused on the moment. He's so eager to have people do other things with him. So, and it, again, it lends to the image of him being larger than life. And of course, political cartoonists have a field day with him because of it. And Roosevelt considers the White House to be the sole center of policy making during his administration. He doesn't defer to Congress because he doesn't trust them, right? He's already seen that Congress, especially under Republican control, has allowed big business to run hog wild, essentially. And so he's trying his best to bring that back to center, and he does it by exercising the executive branch. And again, he thinks that this is not necessarily a case of executive versus legislative power, but the executive branch versus the corporations themselves. Again, he thinks that they're the ones who are pulling the strings when it comes to Congress, and so he pitches this as him directly fighting against that. And the limits of the Constitution under Roosevelt are stretched pretty far for the first time. It's not until his cousin Franklin Roosevelt comes into office that it really gets stretched out of proportion, and people start to question the legitimacy and the constitutionality of what he does. But Teddy Roosevelt is one of the first ones to start to pull some of this in some strange directions. And he's already got a reputation as a reform governor of New York before he even becomes president. Again, he fights corruption in just about every position he's in, as police commissioner, as the governor of New York, and so forth. He promotes an 8-hour workday, several legislative regulations on sweatshops while he's in office, the inspections of factories and slaughterhouses. This especially starts to happen after 1906. And he refers to his entire approach to domestic policy as it relates to fighting political and corporate corruption as the square deal. Okay, and when FDR gets into office, we hear about the New Deal a lot, but the square deal is kind of the first original iteration of this, right? Making a deal with the American public to improve their lives somehow. And it involves, right, greater government regulation of corporations, trying to conserve natural resources, right? This is one big thing that Teddy Roosevelt is known for. And creating, of course, all the new regulations when it comes to protecting consumers, right? Especially when it comes to food and medicine contamination, because there is no government regulation to prevent this from happening right now. Okay, if you are, involved in, the food or drug. This is before the Food and Drug Administration is created, but in any one of these industries, it's very easy for things to get contaminated, or for rotting food to get through, or something along those lines. Poison stuff gets through all the time and creates a lot of problems. In 1904, Roosevelt is popular enough in his first term in office that he wins the nomination a second time. And the Democrats nominate a guy named Alton B. Parker, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but Parker doesn't get a whole lot of recognition because he's not very charismatic. Okay, Roosevelt eclipses him far and away in terms of his public appeal. Okay, and so Roosevelt wins both the popular vote and the electoral vote as a direct result. So Alton Parker doesn't really get a whole lot of historical recognition, just because he comes about at a disadvantageous time, I guess is the best way I can put it. And the second term that Roosevelt begins in 1905 begins with the targeting what he refers to as the criminal rich. He believes that the people who are part of the the nouveau riche and the wealthy upper class are making most of their money through criminal means. 1906, he passes the Hepburn Act, and this gives the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, the authority to start setting maximum freight rates for the railroad industry. Okay, so in other words, you're not allowed to give a discount of any type or another to one business or another just because you're friends with them. Okay, so it's basically regulating prices, making sure that everybody is being treated equally here. And like I said, in 1906, when Upton Sinclair writes the book The Jungle, Roosevelt reads it, and he's absolutely appalled by the working conditions and the living conditions, because it's based on reality. And this is, of course, a book that details the reality of the meatpacking industry in parts of the Midwest. Okay, surrounds a Polish family that has to watch all these horrible things get put into the meat. Again, the equipment is not sanitized, the machines are rusty, and things varying all the way from, parts of, the less appetizing parts of an animal to rats to human parts get put into meat grinders on a regular basis. And so Roosevelt has Congress pass the Meat Inspection Act in 1906 to basically say we're going to inspect animal carcasses before and after they're slaughtered, right? Just to make sure that no disease is getting through, that no corruption is getting through, that no animal waste is getting put in with food of any kind, right? So all these kinds of things begin to cause the quality of life in the United States to get a little bit better, right? Fewer people are getting sick now, and people are actually gaining the nutrition rather than all the wasteful nastiness that goes with it. And coupled with that is the Pure Food and Drug Act. This requires that the government have regular inspections in the food and medicine preparation industries, again, making sure that nothing poisonous, nothing no waste or anything is getting into food or medicines of any kind, just to protect people, right? To make sure that people are not just randomly going to get sick and die for no reason. And Roosevelt, of course, is also credited as being the first president who is really into environmental conservation. Over his 2 terms in office, he creates 50 federal wildlife refuges. He has 5 new national parks, 51 federal bird sanctuaries, and 18 national monuments that are all created under him. One of which is the Grand Canyon. Okay, so places like the redwood forest in California, places all over the United States like that. Right, they're all thanks to Roosevelt's conservation efforts. And he also goes a step further because he starts to hire professionals who are embroiled in these particular industries. So you get Gifford Pinchot, for example. He's the first professionally trained forest manager in the United States. And Roosevelt makes him the head of the forestry division of the Department of Agriculture. So his primary responsibility is to make sure that the trees in these national parks are remaining healthy, right? That we don't have any kind of wood rot that's spreading, that bugs aren't getting into trees and destroying things and all that kind of stuff, preventing forest fires and so forth. And he also passes the Forest Reserve Act, and this ends up protecting 172 million acres of federally owned forest from logging. Okay, so trying to prevent industry from encroaching upon nature too much. Again, very much ahead of his time. And overall, there's 45 national forests that are created in 11 western states because of what Roosevelt does. Okay, so again, the modern conservation movements in the United States and all over the world, would probably be pretty proud of Teddy Roosevelt for what he was able to do. The election of 1908 takes a different direction here because now Roosevelt chooses not to try to run for a 3rd term. Okay, he thinks that now that he has won victory in 1904, now that he's proven himself for 2 terms, he thinks that the government is in a kind of a self-sustaining mode and will be able to continue at this particular altitude for a while. Okay? And instead, he endorses the Secretary of War, who's the former governor of the Philippines, William Howard Taft. Okay? And Taft and Roosevelt seem to be cut from the same cloth, right? In terms of their appearance, in some ways, in terms of what they seem to want as political goals for the United States. And so Roosevelt sees in Taft a kindred spirit. Okay, he thinks that Taft is going to be able to carry on his legacy and keep things going very well. Okay, and Taft has a pretty well-recognized political history to him. His father, for example, served in Ulysses S. Grant's cabinet. He graduated 2nd in his class in Yale, so he's a very intelligent man. Serves on the Ohio Supreme Court for a time. And he's very much a strict construction of the Constitution or strict interpretation of the Constitution kind of guy. He thinks that we need to have specific restrictions for the three branches of government, and so he's not as much of an idealist as Roosevelt is. He kind of wants to keep the status quo, and it sounds like a safe choice for Roosevelt. Right? It doesn't sound like this guy is going to really take anything in too strange of a tangent. And Taft is openly endorsed at the Republican convention in 1908 as well. So, again, Roosevelt openly comes out in favor of him, and he thinks that he's leaving the country in good hands. Okay. William Jennings Bryan is chosen again by the Democrats, okay, and Bryan at this point has been running for office, again, since 1896. So he's been doing this for the better part of 10 years almost. He's starting to gain a little bit in age now. And his platform is very similar to Taft. He promises that we're going to regulate businesses, we're going to lower tariffs, we're going to try to get the U.S. on a world stage in terms of its markets. But he doesn't get a whole lot of national attention, again, because Roosevelt is kind of he's created such an ostentatious atmosphere, and he's endorsed Taft. Taft is basically able to ride Roosevelt's coattails for a long time. And Taft does win the election. He ends up winning the Electoral College 321 to 162. And of course, the promise that he makes is exactly what Roosevelt expects him to say. He promises that he's going to complete Roosevelt's work, he's going to continue these progressive programs, policies, and all this. But again, his limitation is the idea that he thinks that as he can be a supportive position as president rather than an innovative one. And Roosevelt is very much on the innovative side. Remember, all of his policies come directly from the executive branch rather than the legislative one. And so Taft is kind of a little bit of a step backward here. Okay, he's kind of going back on what the traditional Republican Party line is from the 19th century, in that he starts to kind of defer to Congress a little bit. He doesn't really exert his authority as much as Roosevelt expects him to. And so Congress is given full authority where legislation is concerned, right? They're the ones who end up passing most of the laws, and in some cases they end up undoing some of what Roosevelt does. And it ends up leading to a big feud between the two men. Okay. For one thing, Taft's personality is very different from Roosevelt's. Again, Roosevelt is very forceful, he's very much larger than life, very outgoing, and Taft is a little bit more reserved and doesn't really have the oomph that Roosevelt does. For one thing, Taft doesn't do any kind of interviews with journalists. Okay, Roosevelt is out in everybody's face, right? Campaigning from the tops of buildings, tops of cars, tops of wagons, in the public eye at all times. And Taft is a little bit more withdrawn. Okay, again, he's not very forceful compared to Roosevelt. He doesn't try to bully people into getting what he wants, which, to a certain extent ends up relieving some of the pressure in politics to a certain regard. But Roosevelt actually began to use his forcefulness toward a common good. Okay, so this is again a little bit of a step backwards. And over time, he gets a lot of Republicans who start to criticize him, right? Especially pro-Roosevelt Republicans. And he starts to be pretty dismissive of them, and actually in some cases refers to them as quote-unquote assistant Democrats instead. Okay, so he's becoming more partisan in his approach to things. By 1910, though, the Republicans end up splitting into conservative and progressive camps because of Taft and Roosevelt. Okay, Roosevelt is the more progressive camp, and Taft becomes much more conservative than what Roosevelt expects. Okay, so there's a lot of instances here that end up, again, going back on what Roosevelt ends up expecting to happen. And Roosevelt at this point is actually out of the country. Okay, once Taft wins the election, Roosevelt kind of breathes a sigh of relief, and he and his son, named Kermit, just like the frog, yes, Kermit Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt go on a hunting expedition to Africa, and they're gone for several months. And when they come back, Taft has completely, overturned so many of Roosevelt's policies that Roosevelt is infuriated by it. And so we get the Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Richard Ballinger, who comes in and begins opening federal land to commercial development again. So a lot of the conservation efforts that Roosevelt enacted start to get, again, turned back over, and now logging industries are coming in and taking over forests again. And it gets to the point where Gifford Pinchot, the man who is responsible as the chief of forestry, is actually fired because he comes out in opposition to Taft. He tells the public that he doesn't approve of what Taft is doing. He's going back on his word, and it ends up coming across very negatively. All that to say, Taft does have a few successes under his belt. Okay. For one thing, regardless of the fact that he ends up going back on a lot of conservation efforts, somehow he manages to preserve more federal land than Roosevelt does. Okay, and Roosevelt does a certain amount over the course of 8 years, and somehow Taft manages to do more than Roosevelt does in 4 years. Okay. He has twice as many antitrust lawsuits that are passed during his presidency, and one of them is actually so successful that it breaks up Standard Oil. Okay, so Standard Oil, again, was controlled by Rockefeller, and it controlled 90% of America's oil industry at one point. And so these antitrust lawsuits are finally starting to work a little bit, and so these monopolies are starting to break up. So some of the the fighting against corruption and so forth, some of that is actually working. Taft is pro-women's suffrage and is pro-union, so he does get support from those particular contingencies, despite the fact that he's a conservative. 2 years into Taft's administration, Roosevelt is so fed up with what he's seeing Taft do to the legacy that he's left behind, Roosevelt enters politics and actually begins to run against Taft on a completely different ticket. And he starts touting this idea that he calls new nationalism. Okay, he says that this is a new series of progressive reforms that are going to be essentially an expansion on the square deal. Okay, he wants to get corporations to start engaging in social welfare, which is a very tall order. Okay, because up until now, corporations are the ones who are kind of coming out in the exact opposite of most of this. Okay, so Roosevelt is getting more and more idealistic here. He also campaigns for a federal income tax. This is still before the 16th Amendment has been passed. And he also starts to campaign more heavily for child labor restrictions as well. So he's really pushing the reform movements here. And by 1912, Roosevelt is in full opposition to Taft. Okay, once we get to the 1912 election in particular, Taft and Roosevelt are running on two completely different party tickets. Okay, Roosevelt's ticket being a third party. And he announces his candidacy in the 1912 election based on this series of movements, right? He knows he's been a very popular president, and he thinks that he can make a comeback here. Doesn't have the success that he wants in the long run, but he has a lot of momentum. And this is where he and Taft get into a very bitter feud with one another, right? Very bitter politics. He calls Taft a second-rate, hopeless fathead, and Taft calls him a dangerous egotist and a demagogue, right? He thinks that Roosevelt is this individual who is just, so full of himself, and Roosevelt thinks that Taft doesn't know what he's doing. And to add insult to injury, even though Roosevelt initially starts to campaign on the Republican Party ticket, Taft actually gets the official nomination, and so Roosevelt is extremely upset by this. Six weeks after Roosevelt is defeated at the Republican convention and doesn't get the renomination that he'd hoped for, he actually ends up being so bitter about this that he ends up breaking away entirely from the Republican Party, and he and his supporters reconvene in Chicago to create the Progressive Party, okay, which we also know as the Bull Moose Party. Okay. And this comes from his particular claim that he feels as fit as a bull moose. Okay, he has been out of politics for a while now. He's already kind of gone on an extended vacation, right, with his son in Africa, and once he comes back, he thinks that he is fit enough to run for a third term, which, again, no president at this point has managed to do. And every time that Roosevelt gets up to speak, he becomes more and more of a demagogue in his way of approaching the topic, okay, whatever it happens to be. He begins to use this sort of air of what we can refer to as political religion, right? He starts to basically cast everything as a moral argument, says that the apocalypse is coming, right? That, this is humanity's last stand, and if you want to, come down on the right side, vote for me. Okay, so there's a really, really heavy saturation, I won't even call it a tinge, of religious imagery that Roosevelt begins to play into this, because remember, the country is already at a point where they're, the people are not too thrilled with capitalism at this point. They really have started to embrace socialism more and more. We start to see the emergence of other different types of, politics at this point. There's anarchy in some cases. And so Roosevelt is really trying his best to cling to this idea of a progressive republicanism that has now, again, spiraled off and become something entirely. And the Progressive Party becomes more and more of a liberal party. Okay, and again, this is something that's completely out of the ordinary for a party that was originally steeped in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party went from being, again, the party of Lincoln and more forward-thinking to pretty steep conservatism for a long time, being entrenched with big business, and now this particular movement is starting to emerge right back out of that again. Okay, and it all has to do with the progressive movement. Okay, so there's no not really a big surprise that the Progressive Party is a progressive party. Okay. A lot of what Roosevelt begins to tout is the kind of thing that his second cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, begins to use once he becomes president several years later. He starts to promote a minimum wage, which is something that's pretty ahead of its time. Of course, he's on board with women's suffrage. This actually comes to fruition in 1920, right? Still ahead of its time. He starts to campaign for finance reform. So again, anytime there is, or campaign finance reform, I beg your pardon, worded a little strange there. And what I mean by that is that basically if someone is, if you're campaigning for an office, there's only so much money that you're allowed to, take from other individuals. Basically, it targets the spoils system, tries to prevent it from gaining the upper hand again. One of the biggest things that Roosevelt starts to push for, and something that's way, way ahead of its time in terms of a more socialistic idea, is a social security system. Okay, so for anybody who is ill, unemployed, and/or disabled. Okay, so and again, this is something that his cousin Franklin Roosevelt does end up putting into play in, I think it's either 1940 or 1941. So this is again very much ahead of its time in that regard. And of course, because Roosevelt is, committed to the idea of reforming the spoils system, he also targets the boss system. Okay, so individuals like Boss Tweed, right, these kind of little crime rings that are going on in major cities, he's trying to do away with all that and bring it back to this idea of honest government. And instead, what happens is, because Roosevelt, again, comes out of the Republican Party, which is kind of turning a little bit more toward conservatism again, they start attacking him as being more of a socialist and a traitor than anything else. Okay, and remember, Taft is still running for the presidency as well, and he's gotten the Republican nomination, but Taft is a Republican conservative. Okay, so this is basically a complete divergence away from what the Republican Party wants, at least for the vast majority of voters. Okay. And Roosevelt turns around and accuses Taft of being an elitist, basically, that he is aligning himself with where the money lies, basically saying that he's ignoring any kind of social justice issues, even though some of Taft's own supporters were pro-suffrage and so forth for women. In fact, his daughters were both suffragettes. Taft himself kind of comes off lukewarm to some of these more progressive ideas like that. So Roosevelt is really very much the extremist in this particular instance. Now, the election of 1912 is quite possibly one of the most famous and one of the most important ones that we see in American history, especially in the 20th century, because this is where we have several major players at work here and multiple political parties now. We have actually 4 different political parties that are vying for control here, and each person who is in charge of one of these parties, or who is the nominee for each one, is again, extremely prominent and extremely well known. Okay. For the Democratic Party, we have Woodrow Wilson. Okay, and Woodrow Wilson is actually something of a dark horse candidate up until this point. Okay, he doesn't really gain a whole lot of attention or a whole lot of momentum. He's actually pretty sturdy and pretty stable as a candidate goes throughout all this. Okay. Again, he's part of this new form of the Democrats, where the Democrats have moved away now from uber conservatism into more social reform, and especially after we saw the example that William Jennings Bryan gave in the election of 1896. Okay, so the party has been undergoing this very slow metamorphosis into its current point. So Woodrow Wilson is for the Democrats. Taft represents the Republican Party as their official nominee. Eugene Debs, who we briefly discussed back in Chapter 17, he's the Socialist Party ticket leader here. Okay, and Debs has already gained a reputation for being pro-organized labor. He's been pretty controversial too, because he's also gotten entrenched with some radicalized labor. Okay, so he's been associated with several strikes that have gone violent. In some cases, anarchy has kind of been associated with him, and again, even socialism and in some cases communism have been associated with him as well. So he's a very different type of candidate, though. He's even though he represents the Socialist Party, he's trying to promote something of a democratic socialism. Okay, so it's he's very similar to perhaps a Bernie Sanders type character like we would see today. And then finally, we have Theodore Roosevelt running on the Progressive Party ticket. Okay, so each one of these four guys is a major player in this particular election, and it's a very dramatic election, and one that comes out in a somewhat surprising way, given what each candidate brings to the table in terms of their experience and so forth. And the fact that all of them agree on certain issues is something that's very out of the ordinary. They all believe that the government needs to directly intervene in the lives of people in order to allow things to be better. Okay, so they all have a progressive tinge to them at varying degrees and varying levels here. One of the most dramatic instances that occurs during this election, and it's quite possibly my favorite Teddy Roosevelt story of all time, is that on October 14th of 1912, Roosevelt is about to get up on stage in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to give a rally for his election. He's about to give a big speech. And a guy named John Schrank actually walks straight up to Roosevelt and shoots him in the chest. Okay, and Roosevelt just very nearly, just barely escapes assassination here. Okay, Roosevelt could very easily have died. What happens, though, if you look at the picture down here at the bottom, the bullet actually passed through a metal glasses case, just barely nicked the corner of it, and passed through, after that, it passed through a 50-page speech that Roosevelt was about to give, and then lodged itself in Roosevelt's chest. Okay, so again, Roosevelt has been very gravely wounded here. He's been shot in the chest. Roosevelt ends up getting up on stage with the bullet still lodged in his chest and tells the people, he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you realize what's happened, but I've just been shot." He says, "But it's going to take more than that to kill a bull moose." So if you ever needed convincing that Teddy Roosevelt is an extremely strong man and very strong-willed, this is it. Okay, because as soon as he tells everybody that, he proceeds to give a speech that lasts for an hour and a half. Okay, he actually fulfills the speech, the 50-page speech that he's got, pulls it out with the bullet hole in it, and gives the speech with the bullet still lodged in his chest. Right, he's got blood coming through the shirt that he's wearing. And then afterwards, he receives medical attention, and only then does the doctor actually tell him that it's safer to leave the bullet inside of him. And so Roosevelt actually lives the remainder of his life until 1919 with this bullet still lodged in his chest. Okay, so he's an extremely tough character, and this should have won him a lot of brownie points with voters. I mean, just based on his character and his tough persona. And especially because he's getting on in years. Okay, he only has about 7 years left in his life, but this is a pretty tough situation for him, and he comes out of it pretty well. When it comes to Taft, Taft is the one who deflates the quickest in this election. He never gains enough traction with voters. There's not enough of a conservative contingency in American society at this point to really support him. And again, Taft is fairly lukewarm when it comes to progressive ideas. Okay, he's not altogether on board with the government spending a lot of money or coming up with a lot of new ideas for how to take care of the American people. He kind of just wants to keep the status quo. And so so people are ready for change at this point, so they push him out of the way fairly quickly. Roosevelt, meanwhile, is still riding pretty strong in all this. He ends up taking this idea of new nationalism and continues on with that. Basically, everything we talked about in the previous slide. Making sure that everybody is on board with the idea of a social security system and women's suffrage and all that kind of stuff. Woodrow Wilson, meanwhile, comes out with something that's very similar to what Roosevelt does, except he refers to it as New Freedom. Okay, and the New Freedom part is where he is actually beginning to target the trust system. Okay, so all the stuff like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were starting to come up with, creating these little trust companies to actually move money around and maintain monopolies and so forth. Woodrow Wilson starts to target that. So basically what most of society believes to be the root of all evil at this point, the capitalist contingency here, Wilson is actually targeting that specifically. Okay, so this becomes kind of the heart of his campaign, very similar again though to what Roosevelt does with new nationalism. For Debs is actually getting on in years as well. He's probably the oldest candidate that we've got here. And he is actually running for president for the 4th time. Okay, and this is the farthest that he's ever gotten, right? That he's actually gotten onto a major ticket here. And he's had to kind of change his message a little bit over time, soften it a bit to where it actually appeals to a bigger portion of the American populace. Because, again, not everybody's on board with the idea of socialism. Okay, they start to look at it as being something that is potentially destructive, right? Because we've seen so many radicalized labor situations that have gone ugly, people getting, assassinated and so forth, riots. He starts to profess that this is something that's supposed to be more of a democratic, Christianized version of socialism. And socialism, in its original form, takes on a very much an atheistic, almost social Darwinist way of looking at things. So he's had to soften this again quite a bit to make it appealing to the people, and it doesn't quite come across as much as he wants it to. So he basically says that instead of going into violent revolution the way that the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and all these guys start to profess, we need to move more into political transformation, right? A soft revolution instead of a hard one. And he actually does win a lot of support from the working class in this case. And again, this is something that is a trend that we've seen in the last couple of elections anyway. A lot of people who are, lumberjacks, immigrants, sharecroppers, right? Anybody who is directly involved in all this, the working class system. And he doesn't just appeal to working class whites. That's another thing that's important to consider. Most of the movements, like the populist movement up until now, have specifically targeted working class whites. And Debs actually is able to gain a wider audience, including immigrants. Okay, so this is part of what makes him such an interesting character in this election. And again, capitalism is something that has started to grow very stagnant for a lot of Americans. Okay, a lot of the problems with society, the wage gaps, the cruelty and everything that's been going on, most of it is attributed to the capitalist system, and especially the actions of the robber barons during the mid and late 19th centuries. So allowing capitalism to run rampant has basically led to a lot of people suffering. And so people start to look for alternatives here, and socialism is a potential alternative, and it's appealing to the working class. Because again, socialism, on paper anyway, actually ends up eliminating social classes. Okay, and social class distinctions. So everybody starts operating on a similar social level is kind of the idea. And ultimately what ends up happening is Woodrow Wilson, again, as this dark horse candidate who's been pretty stable this entire time, ends up winning the election with over 400 electoral votes, 435 to be specific. Okay, so this is a massive amount of support from the Electoral College here. Roosevelt gets 88, Taft only gets 8, and Eugene Debs, as far as I know, does not get any, although he does get a significant minority of votes. Okay, so again, Wilson, because he is taking things in a different direction, because he is a Democrat as well, and this Democratic Party starts to appeal more and more to the American people in its new form, it starts to take on a life of its own now. And supporters of the Bull Moose Party, the progressives in that particular contingency, are constantly subject to party divisions. They have different degrees of concern and support when it comes to how progressive the Bull Moose Party needs to be. And so they end up kind of pulling themselves apart, essentially, and the Progressive Party never makes a comeback after that. And the Republican Party, meanwhile, starts to do what it does in the middle of the 20th century, and that it actually starts to dive even further into conservatism and starts to become the more conservative party in America. So this is kind of the beginning of, again, this depolarization of the political parties in the U.S. Okay, throughout the end of the 19th century, we see the different factors that are playing in, and now that we get to 1912, the Democratic Party becomes the more progressive party, and the Republican Party becomes the more conservative party. Okay? And again, this rift deepens more and more as we continue in the next few decades of the 20th century. When Woodrow Wilson is sworn into office in 1913, he's a very, very optimistic individual, and almost to a naive extent. Okay? He believes that all the promises that he makes when it comes to progressivism are going to be fulfilled very, very quickly. Okay? For one thing, he comes out against what he refers to as the stupid and stiff Republican tariffs. Okay? He believes that this idea of America being completely isolated in its economy is a very bad idea, and a lot of Americans share his idea with this. They think that, we need to diversify our economy more, we need to start stepping onto the world stage a bit more. He also plans to create a national banking system. Okay, and we've been without this since Andrew Jackson was president. Okay, so it's been nearly 100 years at this point. Andrew Jackson got rid of the Second Bank of the United States, which has essentially deregulated American commerce for a long time. And so to actually put a regulatory system in place stabilizes the economy, at least for now, and again, it actually ends up supporting the working class more than actually hurting them. He's also in favor of strengthening the antitrust laws, right? We've already seen the Sherman Antitrust Act being put into place in the last election or two, so he's starting to kind of move in that progressive direction with that. And he's starting to, at least ostensibly anyway, okay, and there's plenty of holes in this particular argument, but he begins to gear his administration toward the idea of human rights instead of property rights. Okay, and again, this is the kind of the general air of the Democratic Party beginning at this point in time, and there's still a massive learning curve with the Democratic Party, and especially with Woodrow Wilson, because he does not exactly practice what he preaches, but we're moving away again from this uber conservative system into something more geared toward taking care of the American people. And just like Roosevelt, Wilson is an active president. Okay, he's the first one that we know of who actually speaks on the radio to the public. Okay, so anybody before him, there have been audio recordings of presidents going all the way back to Benjamin Harrison, as rough as they are, but Wilson is the first one to actually address the public through the radio. He actually holds weekly press conferences to try to, update the people on what his administration is doing. So, and again, we see this happen even today in some cases. And he also goes to Congress on a regular basis. Frequently speaks with the legislators themselves, tries to, work in tandem with them instead of working isolated from them or even in direct opposition. And he does set a good precedent because he pushes more bills through Congress in the first 2 years as president than any other president has done before him. So he is actually, doing the job. He is actually working quite a bit. Behind the scenes, there's an individual who's a friend and advisor of his named Edward House, who is kind of whispering in the president's ear throughout this entire point and telling him, what he thinks the president should do with the American public and so forth. And some of it is a little bit questionable, again, bordering on naive and even dangerous in some instances. And especially the closer we get to the First World War, the more this starts to, be evidenced as being naive. But House is very much like, again, I can only think in modern terms of someone like Roger Stone, who we see in controversy and so forth in the news today with the president. But this is an individual, again, who is constantly influencing the president in one way or another. And one of the specific things that House tries to push is this idea of a Christian democracy based on charity. Okay. And Wilson, again, is either extremely ill-informed or extremely naive, or both, about the way that the rest of the world operates in politics. Okay. For one thing, when Wilson comes into office, he does so at the same time that most of the other countries in the world are still operating as monarchies. Okay, one or two instances we again continue to see the different political situations, like what happens in Russia eventually with the communist revolution, start to change into a completely different format than anything the world has ever seen before. And so Wilson thinks that if he can continue with this idea of Christian democracy in America, eventually he thinks that this is going to spread all over the world. And not everybody is on board with this idea. Okay, so this is one of the big stumbling blocks for Wilson in terms of his idealism. We also end up with something called the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act. Okay, this is basically what fulfills the first promise that Wilson tries to come out with, right? This idea of lowering tariff rates. And this is an idea to basically balance out what happens with the 16th Amendment, because we end up with the first income tax with the 16th Amendment. And the income tax, again, starts to charge people more, again, causes people to lose money, of course, in certain instances. But when you lower tariff rates, it balances things out because it makes things easier to sell at market, and you actually could potentially gain a profit from it. So it's a pretty ingenious way of handling these two situations at the same time. So what it ends up amounting to is you have a 1% income on any income that's more than $3,000 a year, or $4,000 for married couples. And for most people in the United States, this actually doesn't affect them at all. Okay, you have to be relatively wealthy in order to be able to have to pay taxes. Okay, most people, especially the working class, are only making maybe a few $100s a year. Okay, by comparison. So adjusted for inflation, this is it's not that big of an effect on most people. Okay, if you make $50,000 or more, it's a 7% income, and $50,000 or more is usually for someone who's a member of the upper class, someone who's extremely wealthy. So most Americans, like I said, don't make more than $3,000 a year at most. Okay, the middle class, on average, probably only makes, if I had to guess, maybe in the $1,000 to $2,000 range, give or take. Okay, on an annual basis, and don't have to pay an income tax. So this really is targeting the wealthy, the nouveau riche that we started to look at in the Gilded Age. So it starts to see kind of the decline of that major wealth gap, at least at first. Okay. The Federal Reserve Act is also passed by Congress in December of 1913. Okay, this is what fulfills Wilson's second promise here, in that it actually creates the national banking system that we're looking for. We end up with 12 regional districts. Each district comes with its own Federal Reserve, and anybody who is in charge of a chartered bank who agrees to be regulated by the Federal Reserve Bank ends up having to join the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so this is kind of a voluntary thing, more so than anything at first. Okay, being regulated by the Federal Reserve is basically guaranteeing that there's going to be money in the bank, and that certain actions are not going to be criminal in nature over time. Okay, it's a government oversight system, is what it is. As you can imagine, because there is still plenty of greed going on, there is still plenty of the kind of a leftover from this whole spoil system and rampant capitalism. 2/3 of the banks in the United States choose not to join the Federal Reserve. Okay, most of them are state banks who don't do this. Okay, so there's still a bit of a division between state-bound politics and federal politics, even at this point. And any bank that is short on cash, who is a member of the Federal Reserve System, can borrow from the Federal Reserve itself, what we refer to as the Fed today. So, in other words, you can borrow money from the federal bank if your local bank is running out of money, and if you're a member of the Federal Reserve System. And regional banks are also in charge of issuing currency to member banks in exchange for any of their loans. Okay, so it's not necessarily getting money for free. In other words, you are actually handing over the loan contracts to the to members of this particular bank. That way, the loans themselves are secured, if nothing else. And if you are a member bank, you're required to have a certain percentage of total deposits in cash on hand at all times. Okay, so in other words, you're not allowed to overextend yourself, right? If you're being monitored by the Federal Reserve, you have to have money in the bank physically to back up any loans or any cash or anything like that. And the Fed is actually, again, very directly responsible for a lot of the economic stability and growth that we see at this point in time. It ends up keeping many banks stable during any kind of economic crisis. And the United States stays pretty stable all the way up, again, until the Great Depression as a result of this. So there's still plenty of holes in this particular system, but for now it's working. And Wilson also establishes the Federal Trade Commission. Okay, this is something that replaces the Bureau of Corporations, which was relatively ineffective, to be quite honest. This is what ends up becoming an even greater oversight into trade practices that are considered to be unfair or even criminal, and is able to issue cease and desist orders to anybody who's a violator of it. Okay, so if you are a corporation who is violating the law somehow, rather than the government looking the other way and practicing the laissez-faire tactics, the Federal Trade Commission comes in and slaps you with a cease and desist order, or will even potentially shut you down altogether if there's so much corruption. Okay, so this is again a step in the right direction for the federal government. The Clayton Antitrust Act does something very similar to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, this prevents corporate directors from serving on the boards of competing companies. So basically, trying to do away with the Rockefeller and Carnegie type situation. Okay, you're not able to have a vested interest in your competitors. You're not able to make money off of them, in other words. And again, it does more to clarify terms of what a monopoly actually entails. Okay, so there were so many loopholes with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Remember, it was referred to as the Swiss Cheese Act at one point. So this actually plugs up some of those holes, actually starts to be more specific with terminology and so forth, and again, just eliminates a lot of the loopholes. As it relates to Woodrow Wilson and the rest of society in general, okay, like I said before, there is an extreme sense of naivete that is tinged with neglect when it comes to Woodrow Wilson, especially as it comes to notions of race and gender in particular. In 1914, even though he's only been in office for about a year at this point, Woodrow Wilson starts to tell everybody how wonderful his new administration is, how much it's accomplished, and basically is trying to drum up more and more support from people. Okay, of course, he has fulfilled a couple of his promises. Okay, national banking system, lower tariffs, the antitrust laws, and so forth. But the problem is when it comes to racial equality, Woodrow Wilson is almost directly opposed to it. Okay, still an unfortunate leftover of the Democratic Party from before the Civil War, at least at this point. Okay, for one thing, he's got a Secretary of the Treasury who is a supporter of black disfranchisement, a guy named Carter Glass. The Secretary of the Navy is an open white supremacist who advocates for black suppression in the South. And Wilson himself is quoted as saying that he is disgusted by the 15th Amendment in particular, and that African Americans are, quote, an ignorant and inferior race. So when it comes to Wilson's direct relationship with African Americans in the United States, it's hostile in most cases. Okay, it's not even so much neglectful as it is openly hostile. Anybody who is a black person who is working for Woodrow Wilson in his administration is either serving him food or driving his carriage. Okay, it's very menial tasks, and he doesn't really entertain any kind of African American presence in American politics. He refuses to meet with any black leaders. Okay, so anything to do with the first black civil rights movement that we saw during the Jim Crow era, right? That is still going on in the South, by the way, at this point. At the same time, too, though, he's turning around and he's trying to get African Americans to vote for him, even though he doesn't like the idea of them voting in the first place. So, extremely hypocritical in this case, and he still, again, has this very ethnocentric ideology attached to him, and it makes him pretty insufferable to most of the working class in America. And he even openly claims that segregation is beneficial to racial tensions. He thinks that, if we're going to have an argument over race in the United States, we might as well just separate everybody and be done with it. He thinks that that's going to be the best solution. So he's not willing to work on the problem. He's not willing to offer up any new solutions to that. He just likes to keep the status quo as far as that's concerned. And again, when it comes to gender issues as well, he's very dismissive of women's rights. Okay. Even though 2 of his daughters are suffragettes, I mistakenly said Taft earlier. Even though 2 of his daughters are suffragettes, he's not really very much a proponent for women's suffrage. He says it's a state issue rather than a constitutional one, and basically is trying to wash his hands of the situation like many Republican presidents did. Trying to basically say that anything that's not covered in the Constitution is the responsibility of the states. So, in other words, instead of adding a new amendment to the Constitution, we should just let the states do what they will. The situation surrounding one particular suffragette named Alice Paul gains a lot of public attention during Wilson's administration, and it's been relatively suppressed for the most part, but during its time, though, it was pretty outstanding. She directly challenges Wilson and says that women need to start taking more action against politicians in particular. And in March of 1913, in the midst of all of the success that he's trying to tout, she organizes a 5,000-person protest at his inauguration. Okay, so she openly dismisses him. And in 1917, it comes to an even bigger head because she and the National Woman's Party start to picket the White House, and they stay there for several months. Okay, it turns into a long-standing siege almost. And she and many of her supporters are actually arrested at this point, and she is imprisoned for several months, 7 months in particular, and actually ends up going on a hunger strike in the midst of all this. Okay, and hunger strikes, beginning at this point in time, begin to be extremely popular as a form of protest. Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, is very famous for engaging in hunger protests during this same time period and even a little bit after. But it becomes such a big public issue that it's later revealed that certain jailers would actually come around and force feed her eggs, runny eggs, through her nose. They would actually hook up a straw system through her nose and actually push them down in that way because she would refuse to open her mouth. Okay, so she's basically being tortured by the American government for protesting. Okay, and eventually this gets Wilson a lot of bad press, and rather than actually sacrifice whatever contingency he has, he ends up giving in and having her released. Okay, so very poor move on Wilson's part. By the time we get around to 1916, again, Wilson is doing his utmost to actually win re-election here. And there's all kinds of little controversies, again, that continue to surround him over time. One includes the appointment of Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. And the reason that this is so controversial is, again, for several societal standards that people were not willing to allow to go a different direction at some point. Brandeis was a Jew. Okay, and so for a Jewish man to be attached to the Supreme Court, while the president is touting Christian democracy, is again seems like a deviation from what people expected to happen anyway. And as far as I know, Wilson was not very much in favor of this. Oliver Wendell Holmes, though, who was actually a very important figure on the Supreme Court and was actually kind of the de facto leader of the group, actually was very welcoming of Brandeis' appointment and actually made a big deal about how this was something that was actually moving America in the right direction for a change. So you hear all kinds of stuff about Holmes throughout this time period as well. The big question surrounding him comes when World War I shows up, questions of freedom of speech and so forth and all that. So we'll see him again once we get to World War I. Another thing that happens in 1916 is the Federal Farm Loan Act. So this grants a little bit more freedom to farmers in the working class, gives them a little bit of reprieve here. allows banks to offer loans to farmers from anywhere from 5 all the way up to 40 years for low interest rates. So kind of helps farmers climb out of this depression that they've been in for so long, okay, and starts to relieve some of the pressure and the tension from all the industrialized farming that's been going on, helps the farming industry make a little bit of a comeback. And so now farmers are allowed to borrow up to 50% of the cost of their land when it comes to any one of these loans, to buy whatever it needs to be, seed or tools or anything like that. And the Keating-Owen Act in 1916 starts to ban products made by child workers under the age of 14, okay, and prevents them from being shipped across state lines as well. So again, taking up the mantle of progressivism in this regard, again, it's a step in the right direction, even though Wilson has plenty of faults of his own when it comes to targeting the working class and so forth. The Adamson Act of 1916 is another thing. This creates an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. Grants time and a half for overtime, and starts to create an actual federal commission to look at working conditions in the United States. So again, everything that Wilson is actually putting through, for the most part, is starting to fulfill a lot of the progressive movements that we start to see, from the middle part of the 19th century all the way up until this point, for all the faults that Wilson himself has. And so now, this laissez-faire attitude that the government has had from the Republican Party toward big business and all that finally starts to die. Okay, people are not really in favor of allowing this to continue anymore. They're looking at the government to actually create reform and actually do something about it. And so now, finally, the federal government is expanded enough to where it's able to reach into federal jurisdictions as well as state and local jurisdictions as well. It's starting to actually have more influence than it has ever before. And again, the air of the day is that the government itself has a responsibility to protect its citizens from corruption and to, engage in the welfare of the community rather than actually, shoving them out of the way or anything. And surprisingly enough, this actually ends up reducing voter turnout instead of doing the opposite. Okay, most people would think that this would cause more people to come out and vote in support of a president like this, but apparently because the government was doing so much, people thought, there's no reason to campaign for something that's being done already. And of course, there are other issues as well, right? We have, the introduction of mass culture and pop culture now, so people have all kinds of different social distractions that are keeping them away from politics. They're going to the movies, they're going to the theater and museums and circuses and all kinds of other things. And now politics are shifting away from elected officials over into trained experts. So the whole commission system, right, the Wisconsin plan and all that kind of thing, is starting to take precedence in local politics rather than big political issues. And the thing that really spells the demise of the progressive movement, even though your textbook claims that it goes all the way until 1920, in reality it's World War I. Okay, because now, and especially now that Woodrow Wilson is still in office, World War I actually begins in 1914. America doesn't get involved until the very end. But eventually we're pulled away constantly from domestic progressive issues, and we start to have to look at things on a world stage more than anything. And it ends up distracting us so much that we end up abandoning progressivism altogether. Okay, so we'll start to see how all that plays together once we get into the next chapter.